Good morning. Is this on? Do you want to be on the panel? You can be on the panel. Are we on? Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Could you all take your seats? Thank you all for coming. It's a nice crowd. It's not for me on a gorgeous day. Good morning. I'm Jeff Goldberg from the Atlantic magazine, and we're here for another lighthearted and optimistic conversation about the future of the Middle East. I always joke that it's the special group of Aspen masochists who come to these sort of, but that's most people, it seems. This is going to be a really interesting conversation, mainly because we have a fantastic panel. It's like my dream team. We're going to talk about a lot of things, not just what the future map of the Middle East may look like, but what's going on right today. There's no point in speculating about the future when the future is happening right in the news. You know who all these people are. You have it in your books, but very, very briefly, Shadi Hamid at the end from the Brookings Institution, one of the great scholars of modern Islamist political movements, author of the new book, Temptations of Power, which I think is on sale down the road. And he's a nice guy, and I'm sure he'll sign it for you if you catch up with him on the path. Anne-Marie Slaughter, you all know, former top State Department official, president of New America Foundation, and Aspen superstar. My dear friend, Dalia Mogahed, formerly of Gallup, who just has a new job. I just learned about this 10 seconds ago. Director of Research at the Institute of Social Policy and Understanding in Washington, and really one of the great experts on, among other things, Arab public opinion, Middle East public opinion. And so they're about, I want to cover a few topics today. Obviously, we want to talk about the shifting map of the Middle East and what it means and what the populations of places like Iraq and Syria want, because this is also kind of a mystery to us. I want to talk about the rise of Islamist parties and the rise of extreme Islamist groups like ISIS. We want to talk about American foreign policy and the interventionist impulse versus the sort of isolationist impulse, and how that argument reverberates in the Arab world. I want to talk about the future of Egypt, and we'll do those in about 5 minutes, and then we'll move on to the hard stuff. But I thought maybe why don't we just talk for a minute about what's happening right now? Because, and I mentioned this in a session yesterday, the term inflection point is a overused term, and it's very hard to know when you're in a historical moment. It's easy to know 20 years later whether it was a historical moment or not. But you know, when you have a group like ISIS that literally in the last 2 weeks takes a bulldozer to the border of Syria and Iraq, a border that was drawn by British and French diplomats 98 years ago, and physically erases it and says, this no longer exists. And you have 3 days ago, the leader of ISIS coming out and saying, well, we're now restoring the caliphate for the first time since the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. We are in a moment. And maybe, Shadi, you can start by just talking about two things. One, what does this moment mean? Is this a blip, or are we moving into a whole new phase of Arab politics, if you will? And also, what does this say about the role of Islamism in the politics of the region?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I think we're entering a kind of Salafi jihadi moment in the Middle East, where you have the more mainstream Islamist groups like the Muslim Brotherhood that believed in achieving an Islamic state through the political process in a kind of gradual reformist way over the long term. Here you have these new extremist actors like ISIS that are saying, look, the Brotherhood, that could take 30 years, 40 years. Let's not go gradual. We can create an Islamic state right now through brute force. And that's what they've been able to offer. They've been able to do something that groups like the Brotherhood haven't even come close to. So whatever happens to ISIS in the coming weeks and months, they have succeeded in changing the terms of a discourse. So in a sense, you know, we're not talking much about the Muslim Brotherhood anymore, even though they still are the largest Islamist movement in the region. All our attention is on the ones who use violence. And I'm worried about the broader trend here. Violence, in a way, works. That's what I think is so scary about this moment in the Middle East, whether it's autocrats who are repressing their opposition with abandon. And then on the other hand, you have these Islamist groups that say, well, we're going to be pretty brutal about this.
Let me just push back on one point and help you add to another point. The argument you're making is that Muslim Brotherhood tries to work through the political process. We saw in Egypt, and you might disagree with this interpretation, but we saw that Morsi essentially launched, before the coup against Morsi, he launched a kind of coup against the constitution in some ways. It's very hard to think of the Muslim Brotherhood as truly moderate. Maybe when you stand them next to Al-Qaeda, everybody looks moderate. But talk about, if you can just for 1 second, and maybe Dalia, you can jump in on this, the Muslim Brotherhood and its actual commitment to democratic ideals. You know, King Abdullah of Jordan told me a couple of years ago, you remember this, he said that, you know, for people like Erdogan and even more for Morsi, who is just, in his mind, a crude version of Erdogan, the leader of Turkey, you know, democracy is like a bus. When you get to your stop, you get off. In other words, one election, one time, you know, and that's it. And the second point is also on ISIS. Aren't these groups so extreme that they're kind of self-annihilating in a way? Like, this is not a group that knows how to manage an economy. Yeah. I mean, so don't they burn out?
Yeah, sure. So
and I'll come in. You'll both come in on that. But Shadi, you want to go quickly on that?
So I think when we're talking about mainstream Islamists like the Brotherhood, I would say they are committed to the democratic process, but they use the democratic process to pursue illiberal objectives, a kind of social conservatism. They want to Islamize society, and that can mean things as simple as restricting alcohol consumption, segregation of the sexes, changing the educational curriculum to be more Islamic, if you will. But I don't think that means that they're against democracy. And I think we have to, as Americans in our own history, liberalism and democracy went hand in hand. So when we say democracy, we're thinking about liberal democracy. I think we have to problematize that notion that you can actually have, the more democracy you have in the Middle East, that might actually empower very socially conservative actors. But the Brotherhood isn't extreme in that respect because they're reflecting something that's deeply felt in these societies. And Dalia can maybe jump in and may disagree with me on some of this, but I mean, we're talking about large majorities in countries like Egypt that say they believe in the implementation of Sharia law. They want to see more Islam in their politics, not less. So any democratically elected leader has to respect that social conservatism. On ISIS, I would say, we're seeing a different model of extremism. In the 2000s with Al-Qaeda, it was a kind of blow things up destructive model. There was no vision of building, right? What's so interesting about ISIS, they're very extreme, but we do see a process of political learning. They're actually able to hold territory, provide social services. One of the first things they did when they took over Mosul, they had a 16-point communique, a kind of social contract, if you will, and there's actually a notion of citizenship there. They're very brutal, and there are limits to what you can do, but as long as you abide by their rules, you can be an active participant in the recreation of the caliphate. So I think there is some appeal there for at least for many Iraqis, certainly, and we've seen that.
Right. Both of you want to jump in? There's a whole bunch of stuff on the table.
I just want to jump in on the idea that they're so extreme they'll burn themselves out, and I think I'm agreeing. But let's remember the Taliban in Afghanistan, who were very violent and very extreme, and ran Afghanistan and of course hosted Al-Qaeda for many years. I mean, if you think back to the late Clinton administration, there was report after report of how women could not go anywhere. Madeleine Albright was deeply engaged in that when she was Secretary of State, and they were happily ruling the country until we went in and overturned them with ground troops. So one point is, it's not clear to me that necessarily they can't hold this way. And the second, which is a point that does not get talked about enough, I think, in discussions like this, is the extent to which, when you have a really bad, corrupt government, people will turn even to real extremes to get some measure of justice and functioning government. This is the argument of a forthcoming book, Thieves of State, by Sarah Chase, who wrote Punishment of Virtue, who lived in Afghanistan for 10 years, and who sees up close exactly how, given how bad the government is, stealing people, taking women, bribes constantly, that ultimately even moderates will say, you know, I don't like these extremists, but at least we have clean government. parallels in Christianity too, right? I mean, the Reformation, when you go back and you look at Martin Luther and you look at the Catholic Church, there are parallels in other religions at other times. So I think we have to factor in the fact that the government in Iraq has not been a decent government. And that's part of the, it's not the appeal, but it helps explain why you don't automatically get rejected.
To challenge actually an assumption I think we're making about Islamists and why they either succeed or fail. And I think we often assume that people are either voting for them or against them because they either want or don't want Sharia. And I don't actually think that's true at all. And the polls bear this out. Why people voted for Morsi or why they voted for the Muslim Brotherhood in the parliament in Egypt actually had very little to do with their desire for an Islamic State. It was about believing, rightly or wrongly, that these would be the best people to deliver normal, everyday life, services. They thought they were going to be the clean government that Egyptians have been wanting. And when you look at, it's very interesting in the polls, people who voted for the liberal groups like the Free Egyptians, those who voted for the Muslim Brotherhood, and those who voted for the Salafis had exactly the same sort of social values, believe it or not. They believed almost exactly the same things about women's rights, about Christians, about the role of, sometimes even the role of religion. But why they voted for one versus the other was really the same reasons many of us vote for who we vote for here in the United States. It's who they believed were going to be the most competent. And exactly a year ago now, when people went out into the street and demanded an early election, however many those numbers were, they're quite contested, in a popularly backed coup, they also were not coming out against an Islamist agenda as much as they were against an incompetent, what they believed were an incompetent government, and fundamentally what they believed was a government that was against the Egyptian state.
Could I ask you this? And by the way, Dalia and I usually fight a lot, but it's Ramadan and she's fasting. So, and by the way, in monotheistic solidarity, I'm also going to be fasting for Ramadan between breakfast and lunch. So I'm going to go. I'm going to go here. Yes. Get rid of it. I don't want to tempt you.
I was just about to go for it. No, I saw it. I saw it.
I'm trying to protect your soul. But I want to push back on something here. And well, it's not really a pushback. It's sort of a saying, why did the Muslim Brotherhood blow it so badly? I mean, it was, you could call the numbers contested. Tahrir Square was full. This was a, it was a coup. No doubt it was a coup, but it was a popular coup.
There were a lot of people out there. I totally understand.
The Brotherhood has been waiting for 70 plus years to take over Egypt. It gets Morsi in there, and he blows it in a year. What happened?
Well, I think there's lots of things that happened. I'm going to take first the very critical view of the Morsi administration. They were incompetent. They mismanaged a lot of things. They weren't inclusive enough. If you look at change management from a business point of view, the right thing to do is to spend most of your time with your fence setters, the people that you can sway to your side, and the least amount of time with your base and with those who will never agree with you no matter what you do. What did Morsi do? He spent all of his time either with his base or in trying to appease the deep state, which was never going to come to his side.
The deep state meaning the military infrastructure.
Military infrastructure, while completely ignoring the fence setters who actually elected him, the revolutionaries who weren't loyal Muslim Brotherhood supporters, but they wanted real democracy. He didn't spend enough time with them. So that's the critical view of what they did. But there's another side, which is there was a lot of things against him. I mean, we have to be honest and recognize that he had a deeply entrenched state system that was never going to truly let him govern. And this is documented. This is not a conspiracy theory. You had a police who literally refused to work for a year. You had state apparatus that just was unwilling to subordinate to a civilian elected president, and especially one from the Muslim Brotherhood, who they have for the past 70 years been told is the enemy of the state. You just can't change a system that entrenched overnight. And so there was a lot to explain why he didn't work out. But what happened a year ago on July 3rd, I believe, was of course, a coup, and that's, I think, beyond debate, but a terrible thing.
I think the administration view is a coup-like event.
A coup-like, an event formerly known as a coup.
An event formerly known as a coup. Right.
And I think it was something that was detrimental to the region, detrimental to Egypt, and detrimental to the United States.
If I could just jump in.
Yeah, and then Anne-Marie, please.
Yeah, on one point there, is that it's true that the ordinary Egyptians who were out last year against Morsi, for them maybe economic issues were at the forefront, but if we're talking about the liberal elites who drove the sentiment against Morsi, there was a fundamental ideological divide between Islamists and non-Islamists, and we see this now throughout the region. And it's, in that sense, it's kind of different than recent transitions that we might be more familiar with, Latin America or Eastern Europe, where the primary cleavages were economic in nature, at least somewhat economic in nature. You can split the middle on the economy. That's tangible. You can quantify that. But how do you split the middle on religion or ideology? And it's almost metaphysical in a way. The meaning of the state, the purpose of the nation state, the identity of the state. And you heard this rhetoric so much from people close to the military in Egypt, that the Brotherhood was going to change the identity of the state. So these issues that have to do with identity and the role of religion in public life arouse these very raw existential passions. And I think in that sense, it's more comparable to the revolutions of 1848 or the religious wars in Europe before that. We're talking about the state here, the foundations.
Anne-Marie, let me ask you.
Or here. I mean, we did hear Hillary Clinton yesterday talking about Hobby Lobby and the religion and the state. I mean, these are issues we non-violently hear, but they involve deep passions.
Anne-Marie, let me ask you this from an American policy perspective. One of the themes that's been coming through in the Ideas Festival on the foreign policy discussions is that the United States doesn't really have a strategy, an overarching strategy for how to deal with the Middle East. And there is a fight in Washington over, before we talk about the physical borders, let's talk about who we think would be best for the Middle East and who would be best for us. And there is a fight in Washington. There are people who say there is no such thing as an Islamist Democrat. There is no such thing as an Islamist who would be an ally of the United States. There are others who say this is the reality that we've been dealt and we have to deal with these kind of people. Where do you come down on that issue?
So when I was at State before the Arab Spring, so I left in January of 2011, and the Tunisian government had fallen, the Egyptian government hadn't. But in those 2 years before, there was a growing consensus that we needed to engage political Islam, right? That Obama had come in, the Cairo speech,
yeah.
And but even the Cairo speech is sort of a new beginning with the Muslim world across the board. This was then, you had the military, the intelligence community, who really were very, very nervous about engaging political Islam, whether it was the Muslim Brotherhood or in any different format. And many of us who felt like there's just no way we're going to get from where we are now to where we need to be without doing that. Because we had countless memos that said this won't last. It's not as if we thought Mubarak was going to disappear the following February, but everybody knew that it wasn't going to keep holding. You had just demographically, you had these enormous youth bulges, you had a huge unemployment, you had growing unrest, you'd had, however, 70 demonstrations in Egypt in the year before Tahrir Square. So we knew that somehow we had to get to a place that was not just strongmen, and we had a lot on engaging with political Islam, and I think I'm of the view that we really don't have any other option, that we should have. I would have actually called it a coup. I would have
when Morsi was.
When Morsi, yes, I would have said, look, we have very few cards in the short run, and we had even fewer because the Saudis, of course, are completely supporting the deep state. But from the long run perspective, I thought we need to play for the Egyptian people, at least in being as honest as we can be, because we've been dishonest for a long, long time. And so I thought we could at least say, okay, this is a coup. We absolutely don't like what Morsi was doing, but we also don't accept this option.
So Dalia, and I want to get back to Iraq and Syria and what people of those countries actually want, but stay on Egypt for a second, because we've been talking about this. We are, from one perspective, making the same mistake with Sisi that we've made for so many years with Mubarak. In the sense that he's not a Democrat. He's even less sophisticated in his management of the country than Mubarak. In retrospect, only now do we understand that. Is the United States making a mistake by supporting, even though we have these qualms about it, we're still functionally supporting Sisi and the military, and we didn't obviously fight very hard to restore Morsi back to power. Where are we on that? And are we entering a completely new cycle that's a repetition of an old cycle?
I think we are going back to an old cycle, and I think we're doing so for a lot of reasons. But one is that we believe wrongly that the status quo is stability. And I think that we need to challenge that assumption. First, because if you think about all of these things that Anne-Marie just talked about, what led up to the Arab Spring? And it's three things, basically. It's no opportunity. You have a growing economy in Egypt, but no prosperity. You have a state that delivers no freedom and no services. So you're not getting your social contract that you usually get, where you can accept less freedom as long as the state takes care of you. You're getting neither. And people really want freedom. These are young people. The majority are below the age of 29, and they have completely different expectations than their parents. So do these three things still exist today? And the answer is, of course. In fact, they're much stronger. So if Tahrir Square happened in 2011, it's going to happen again. But the fear I have is, after the massacres that we've witnessed over the past year, what will that next uprising look like? We have to ask ourselves this question, and what side are we going to be on when that occurs? You
assume that there's going to be a violent response to the Sisi government?
I think there will be a response. I don't know what it will look like, and I'm afraid. This is more of a warning. This is not calling for anything to happen, but I'm afraid that with the kind of violence that we've just witnessed, think about, the numbers that Human Rights Watch has reported in just the Rabaa massacre.
Explain what the Rabaa massacre is.
Okay, so in after Ramadan last year, so this was I guess
August 14th.
August 14th. The military and the police basically went into a sit-in and just killed people. I mean, this was on par and even worse than Tiananmen Square, but got very little media coverage compared to its gravity. And Human Rights Watch said it was the worst use of force in Egyptian modern history, and possibly really in modern history. So when you have that kind of state violence, it is going to, unless there can be some reform and accountability for that, I'm afraid that it will create an environment where extremists will have a room for people's psychological space for people to listen.
And if I can just add, just think what Kent State did in this society. 4 people, right? And we're old enough to remember. Just think what it was to have the government open fire on innocent students, and what that did in this country, a stable democracy for 200 years, and then think about what that's like, if it were your children or your friends' children or the people you know. I mean, that's an enormous thing.
I want to loop back around to Egypt, but let's go to this question of literally what the map is going to look like. And I want to do it from, talk about it a little bit from what, not necessarily Arab polling is showing us, but 2 questions. The first is, do you think that we are now witnessing the end of Syria and Iraq? And the second question is, and this is something that flummoxes people here, I think, Iraq and Syria in particular are imperialist creations. These are countries manufactured by Britain and France 100 years ago. Disparate groups roped together for no particular reason except that it was advantageous to the British and the French. And yet there seems to be an impulse on the part of many people who live in these countries to say, we want to keep these countries together. It's a little bit of a contradiction. Can you talk about where this is going, whether or not ISIS is successful or not, and also what people seem to want? Because it's very confusing to us right now.
Yeah, so I think we are seeing the end of Syria and Iraq as we know it. and we're never going to get back to the way things were. So even if the Iraqi government holds the territory it currently has, it's unlikely it will be able to recapture all the lost territory that is majority Sunni. But I think if we're looking more broadly, I think that one of the legacies of the Obama administration, and I hate to say this as someone who was an early supporter of Obama, but it will compare with George W. Bush just in the sheer scale of messing up the region. I think Obama's legacy on the Middle East will be terrible. And he's essentially presided over the effective breakup of the Middle East. I don't want to put too much blame on him, but the U.S., America, we're part of the problem. We're part of the problem.
Are you saying that if Bush's mistake was overreaction to events? Are you suggesting that Obama's reaction is underreaction?
Obama has become almost the mirror image of Bush. And I mean, he sees his legacy, I understand it, as extracting the U.S. from two costly, tragic wars. But that doesn't mean we take it to its extreme. And I think that's where, so for example, on Egypt, and this applies to other situations too, when I talk to state and defense officials, they agree with me on Egypt. They agree with me on my basic assessment. It's not an information problem. But what I keep on hearing is, well, what can we really do? Do we have a lot of influence? A lot of people are killing each other. Does America have a role? This administration has a philosophical, almost ideological self-doubt about America's ability to play a constructive role in the world.
Wait a second. I mean, we've just went through 12 years or 13 years of America trying to re-engineer, unsuccessfully, re-engineer Arab societies. It's not purely ideological to say that we're not really good at that.
There is empirical evidence to that.
There is some empirical evidence, as Dalia points out. So why is it absurd for President Obama to say, you know what? It turns out that America has limited ability to shape reality in the Middle East. These are grown-ups. These are ancient civilizations, complicated societies.
But I'm not talking about re-engineering. I'm talking about finding a happy medium between what Bush did and what Obama is now doing. It doesn't have to be an either-or thing. And let's also distinguish between bad interventions and good interventions. It's not as if the principle of intervention is always wrong.
Well, you know, speaking of intervention, we have Anne-Marie Slaughter right here. So why don't you, can you jump onto that, what he was just saying? I mean, have we been tragically under-involved?
Yes, we have. I mean, so I'll just start. Some of you heard me with Senator Mitchell the other day, and I'll just start by saying, you know, it's hard for me to come at this dispassionately. It's hard for me to come at most things dispassionately, but there we are. In part because 2 years ago, I and others said, unless we intervene, this is what's going to happen, and we are going to end up with an Islamic State. We're going to end up with unbelievable support for terrorist groups. We're going to end up with the dismemberment of Syria. We're going to end up with the destabilization of the region. It's not like that hasn't been obvious, and not just to me, to many other people. And I totally agree that his legacy, here's a man who wanted a new beginning with the Muslim world and who I totally support his ending of both wars, is going to leave the Middle East shattered, right? Shattered in ways that are going to take years and years to replace, and that didn't have to happen. So let me answer the question, your question. We are very bad at re-engineering things on the ground, right? The idea that we can go in with troops and remake a society, we're really bad at that. And I completely agree with this. And I completely agree, actually, with what Marwan was saying the other day. Ultimately, it is up to the Egyptian people, the Syrian people, the Iraqi people to make their own state. That is not what anyone's talking about when we talk about intervention. Nobody wants boots on the ground. Absolutely nobody.
We just put boots on the ground in Iraq. Whether you,
right, but
I mean, let's not.
But in a very.
So you can't say no one because Obama just is sending 300 people back.
But I mean open troops where we go in and conquer and hold territory, which is what we did in Afghanistan and what we did in Iraq.
And Obama would argue that's a slippery slope.
Well, we can have that debate, okay. but here's where the happy medium is between going in and trying to hold territory and remaking states and doing nothing. It is using our power to force a political solution, right? This is what our power is for. There is no military solution here. Everybody agrees on that as well. There's a political solution. The political solution requires that people get to the table and negotiate. They are not going to do that if they think they're winning, as long as they just keep doing what they're doing, which is exactly what Assad has assumed from the moment he realized, nope, we weren't coming in. He realized that first in February of 2012, and then he certainly realized that in September of 2013 with the red lines. So the point is, there's a way to intervene, but it's a way to intervene that forces a political negotiation in a way that prevents things from coming further apart, because even now we can't put things back together.
Dalia, let me bring you into this, because this is one of the most interesting and odd questions about the moment. When in the area, in the Middle East, you know, you hear a lot of people demanding American intervention. I'm not saying boots on the ground, but American military intervention of a sort in Syria. You know, there's a terrible dictator and he's murdering thousands of people, and I hear Arabs all the time saying, we need America's help, we need America's help. 13 years ago, or whatever it was, 11 years ago, Saddam Hussein, an equally bad dictator, I mean, murdered as more people than Bashar Assad over his period of time there. We invade.
Nobody asked for our help, though. They weren't asking us
the oppressed Kurdish people of Iraq certainly did, and the Shia did. Let's not kid ourselves. I mean, there were populations that were very happy to have us do that until we messed it up. But this is what I'm getting at. What I'm getting at is and I count myself in the group of confused Americans. We hear people in the Middle East demanding more engagement. We engage. We hear people in the Middle East telling us to get out. Where is, and you're a pollster, I mean, one of the things you do, where is Arab opinion, if you could even call it, if even it's easy enough to call, you know, a very complicated region, you know, one thing. Yeah. But where is opinion on this right now, not only in Syria and Iraq, but in the broader Arab world, about the American role in the Middle East?
Well, it's a really hard question. It's a good one. First of all, when it comes to specifically intervening in Syria, there is not one Arab opinion. Okay, so it depends on who you're asking and where you're asking. So Egyptians, the biggest Arab country, the majority are actually against American intervention in Syria.
Even though it's a majority Sunni country.
Absolutely.
Right.
They are basically almost knee-jerk against American intervention, period, no matter what. They were even against it in Libya. So Egyptians just no to American military in the region, period. But in other parts of the Middle East, there is a lot more support for American intervention. So it depends on the country, it depends on what they see as a balancing act. There is an inherent feeling, though, that the United States intervenes for the wrong reasons at the wrong time, and doesn't intervene for the right reasons at the right time. So I don't think that there is one overarching, generally, no one overarching opposition or desire for American intervention, but the belief among most people is that we always do it at the wrong time for the wrong reasons.
Can I add something?
Yeah, go ahead.
So that's my greatest fear. So on the one hand, we do now accept, right? You heard from Admiral Mullen, you can hear from General Petraeus, you can hear from absolutely everyone that having a caliphate in western Iraq and eastern Syria is really, really dangerous. Right? We are talking about hundreds of Europeans and Americans going into this area, getting radicalized, much harder. They're much closer to Europe. They're closer to here. It's going to be much harder to track them. This is very, very dangerous. And frankly, it's very dangerous for Israel as well. It may not be right now while everybody's fighting each other.
It's certainly dangerous for Jordan.
Absolutely. I mean, it's dangerous for Jordan, but sooner or later, you know, when you have a state of people who believe what these people believe, who are armed and holding territory, this is just not good. So you're going to see, and you've already seen, a straight national interest justification for, yeah, now we got to act, because now our lives are at stake. This is very bad. I'm terrified that we're going to see the United States willing to intervene because of the danger of Salafis or jihadis or ISIS, however you call them, who might attack us. But we're not going to do a thing about the guy just at the other side of Syria who started a lot of this, who, as I said before, has killed tens of thousands of people. It will be hundreds of thousands by the time it's through, in the most brutal way. What does that say to Arabs across the region. I mean, that's just, we're doing it once again.
But let me, and we're going to go to questions in a minute, and I'm sure we're going to hear
Thank you out there.
That was the Aspen intervention. That was the Aspen intervention caucus right out there. Thank you all for coming. We have a golf cart waiting for you to take you back to the Pepsi building. No. I'm sure we're going to hear in a couple of minutes from people in the audience who will give voice to this feeling of really enough already with getting involved in the Middle East. But let me play on that because I know where you are on these intervention questions. Okay, fine. So we go bomb Bashar al-Assad. We use some kind of military force, or we ramp up our engagement with that question, and
to force him to the table.
At least to force him to the table. But in so doing, we drop a bomb on a school by mistake, because that's what happens in war, and 50 kids in Damascus are killed. And then the Arab world goes, "Oh my God, look at you guys! You're bombing Arab schools again." I mean, there doesn't seem to be, you know, I'm dispositionally an interventionist, and I agree with you where you're going, but I think we've seen this movie before. I mean, Shadi, how do you engage in this in a way that doesn't lead to more blowback?
So, I mean, what was different here compared to Iraq was that Libyan protesters, Syrian protesters were literally begging us to get involved. They had weekly Friday protests. In October 2011, one of the themes for their Friday was No-Fly Zone Friday. Yeah. They were more pro-intervention than John McCain. Yeah. Right. Okay, so so it's not as if
it's not only Libya where you saw that.
Yeah, no, that was Syria, and the Libyans were saying
right.
the same thing as Gaddafi's forces were marching towards Benghazi. Where is the U.S.? So it's amazing to me that we have a terrible history in the Middle East. We've been supporting autocrats for God knows how long. But when people in their time of struggle, they don't look to China, they don't look to Russia, they still look to us. I think that may be changing now, and people are just, you know, we've given up hope. But there is still this sense that America can play a moral role. And I mean, I think the pretext of intervention is very important. It shouldn't be about narrow security interests or WMDs. It should be about mass slaughter. Yes. And I think as a general principle, if thousands or tens of thousands of people are being killed, we as Americans have to have a national conversation about military intervention. There used to be a name for this, but we don't talk about it that much anymore, the responsibility to protect. And that's what was actually very encouraging about Libya, that it wasn't a vital national security interest, but we were still willing to do the right thing.
And Libyans love us.
And Libyans love us, except that we did the wrong thing by intervening late, and then we left too early, and now Libya is a disaster zone. Yeah. So that kind of goes against your point.
We left Libyans to their own devices. Right when Gaddafi fell, we say, oh, our work here is done, and we leave Libyans to their own devices. There's no real strategy for engaging Libya and helping them rebuild their country.
All I'm doing is arguing as an interventionist who believes we're really not good at intervention, and that's sort of the...
So let's get better.
Okay, we'll start at the next Aspen Ideas Festival, where we'll have a track.
Well, that's what Mike Mullen was saying about needing many, many more tools, and that's right. The military piece it's a critical piece, but it should be a small piece, and it doesn't mean us on the ground trying to reconstruct. It does mean economic aid, all sorts of things that we can do.
And I'll tell you, and I want to call on people, but the most, oh yeah, go ahead.
Jump in here. I think one fundamental step that we often skip, and actually is one of the reasons for many of these issues, is we skip too quickly to nation building without working enough on society building. Yeah, that's fair. So we go right to, okay, what's going to be the social contract without thinking about the social covenant? What do these societies need to agree on in terms of how they will live together? Without that work, without that really hard foundational work of that social covenant, you end up with Libya like it is today. You end up with Afghanistan like it is today. You end up with Iraq like it is today. You end up with Egypt, frankly, like it is today. And I think I don't know that that's America's role, but I think we have to at least acknowledge that that's a step that we often skip, even in talking about.
I'm going to take a wild guess and say, if I polled this audience, how many people here believe that America can build a new social contract in Libya? I think people would be dubious of our own ability to do that.
Not a social contract, and I agree. I don't think it's America's role, but I think we don't even acknowledge that that step needs to happen, or we will almost for sure fail. Right. At society building.
Let me, if I see some hands, I'll, why don't we come right down here first, and if somebody, okay. And please ask your question in the form of a question. Not just you, I mean all of you.
What do you think will be done or should be done by the murder of the 3 Israelis, one of them American dual citizens?
Sir, what was the first part of the question?
What should be done?
Should Israel, what will Israel do? What will the United States do? And what should be done?
Don't all jump at once. Anne-Marie,
So,
you're with the
I mean,
State
I'm not.
Department.
I don't think the United States is going to do anything. I mean, this is an ongoing horrible thing, and it's a terrible tragedy. It's a terrible thing for Israel. It is part of the ongoing killing on both sides, and it is part of the reason that those of us who I think John Kerry has felt so strongly that that's not a stable situation either. In other words, that for Israel since the Second Intifada, it's been much more secure domestically, but it's not actually a situation that can last if there is no hope of some ultimate settlement. So this is for the Israeli government to respond to. I worry, I mean, obviously it has to respond, but there are many killings of Palestinian youth also, and from the perspective of the Palestinians, that's the way they're going to see it. And this is why ultimately this is not an issue I think we can just leave alone. That's why John Kerry was trying so hard and didn't succeed.
If I could add on that. I respect Kerry's persistence on this. I mean, he was doing a lot there. But why are we using, I mean, this was my question from day one with this peace effort. We have a limited bandwidth as Americans. We don't, our resources, budget, we're not good at walking and chewing gum at the same time, as we've found out. So why are we putting so much effort into something that will almost certainly not be solved? I mean,
and it's also a bit of a sideshow at the moment.
Yeah, and I used to, if you talked to me before the Arab Spring, I would have said that Israel-Palestine was absolutely central to the Middle East. I've evolved on that position. I don't think it's as central. And I think we also have to realize that as repressive as Israel is towards the Palestinians, Israel's repression does not compare to what Arab autocrats do to their own people. I mean, that's the...
If I'll just assert my prerogative as moderator, just to give a quick answer on that. I mean, on the one hand, and you're absolutely right. You, as a sovereign government, you can't allow your teenage citizens to be kidnapped, shot in the head, and buried in a field. You have to respond to that. I worry about one aspect of the Israeli response in particular, which is this. Mahmoud Abbas, who's the leader of the moderate Palestinian Authority, has spoken in Arabic, which is very interesting in this context, in Arabic to his people saying, we can't do this. We can't kidnap teenagers. It's not going to lead to the creation of a state. The thing that I worry about is that the Netanyahu government, and especially people to the right of Netanyahu, will use this as an excuse not to hurt Hamas, which is opposed to Israel's existence, and so you can understand where that dynamic will come from, but to actually undermine the Palestinian Authority, which is not useful in this. But there's a question back there, yeah. And I'm looking over here, but
Hi.
This is a very silent. Okay.
So Shadi said that Obama could have done better, and he did such a terrible job, but I'd like to know what should he had done better, because you don't know what would have happened if he had done things differently.
Okay.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, maybe all of you can do that.
Yeah. So look, I can give you a whole list of things, but very quickly, limited military intervention in Syria in early 2012. Anne-Marie and I were actually calling for that at that time in the pages of Atlantic, and only, at that point, only 5,000 people had died. Now it's 170,000. So just think about that for a second. And the idea there is not regime change necessarily. It's not regime change necessarily, but to have a credible military threat to force Assad to the negotiation table. And this is basic human nature. Why would Assad make a compromise if he feels no threat to his hold on power? I think also having a more consistent pro-democracy approach. We've committed only about $2 billion to the Arab transitions from 2011 to 2013. That's a paltry sum. And not to say that this is at the same level as the Marshall Plan and post-World War II, but there we committed more than $100 billion in today's money to Western Europe. So I'm not saying get to 100 billion, but 2 billion versus 100 billion, that shows that we weren't really into this. And let's put pressure on the Egyptian military, not just when they stage a coup, but before they do, and try to have real credibility. But the problem with us as Americans now, we talk about, they shouldn't do this. The Egyptians must do this. So we use this very kind of strong normative language. But why must they do anything if we're not willing to back our rhetoric with policy? And I just came back from living in the Middle East for 4 years in Qatar. And one thing that I realized is when I would talk to audiences and use the phrase red line, people would start chuckling. I would start chuckling on this stage. I can't take it seriously. We have become a laughing stock in the region. Our words are not credible. That's going to take a long time to rebuild.
Let me just add and just talk about the pain of the missed opportunity, because you had in December 2011, Secretary Clinton gave a speech in Doha where she said to Arab regimes across the region, you are on foundations of sand. You are going to crumble. This is December, this is even before, or it's after Tunisia, but before anything else in the region. And you actually have, millions of people wanting democracy and wanting pluralism and wanting clean government, wanting decent government. Now, I'm not saying we could have made it all perfect, but I'm also saying the idea that we just stepped back and said, well, this is going to take a century to play out. It's like 1848 or the French Revolution, and we can't help. That was crazy. We finally had young Arabs across the region standing up for what we said we were for. It's what Condi Rice stood up in Cairo and said we were for, and it's what Barack Obama said we were for. And we started very well. We started very well, I think, with Mubarak, and we started well with Libya. I mean, for all Libya's fragility, if we had not intervened in Libya, there would have been a mass murder in Benghazi. You would have still had civil war. You'd have had Libya come apart completely. Now you have Libyans across Libya who think that the United States saved them, right? Who think that we and the Europeans did what we needed to do. Had we been willing to do that in Syria, in the same way, and again, to force him to the table. And remember, the one time we looked like we were serious, he offered to dismantle his chemical weapons so fast it made your head spin. I mean, the minute he thought his neck might be on the line. So what we missed was.
So wasn't that proof that they take our word seriously?
Yeah, it was.
I mean,
proof
Shadi said they don't take the word seriously, but Assad, but Barack Obama, without firing a shot, managed to extract all of Syria's chemical weapons.
Because he lied, but because it really looked like he was going to do it, right? It was the first time it was credible. We mobilized the cruise missiles. I mean, we all thought we were going to do it, and so did he.
Let me hear from Dalia on that question, then we'll go over here.
Honestly, I have nothing to add to that.
Really?
I don't.
That's the first time that's ever been said at the Ask Ideas. There was a mic, where was it? Right here, yeah.
How significant to American interests is the metastasizing of ISIS in Syria and Iraq, their violence, their influence, their terrorism, and if it's significant, which I think it is, specifically, what would you recommend we do about it?
I mean, yes, it's extremely significant for three reasons. One, again, these guys aren't going away, right? Even Don Rumsfeld sort of said the issue here is, every time you kill a terrorist, how many more are you seeing? You are now seeing a stronger version in many ways, even than the Taliban, much closer to Europe, much more able to take people in, radicalize them, train them, and send them back out. If you think, if you thought that was a threat in 2001 and you thought that was a threat in 2010, it is still a threat, and now it's stronger than it was at the outset. So that's the first thing. The second is the destabilization of the region. I mean, Jordan is really extremely vulnerable. Iraq has come apart. Lebanon, very fragile, worse so now. I think real threat to Turkey. I mean, this is the debate we keep having. I've been asking about the Kurds and if, in fact, there's a separate Kurdish state, what happens to the Turkish Kurds? Erdogan thinks it'll be fine. I'm less certain, but just think about that. What does that mean? Well, it means it's a great scenario for Iran, right? It's a very bad scenario for our allies in the region. And the final point is, you know, it is still a global oil market. Right? We're not energy independent yet. This idea that we can have the major source of the world's oil be destabilized and we're not going to suffer consequences is crazy. So from an economic point of view, from a straight security point of view, and what Mike Mullen said, we can't afford to pivot to China and forget the Middle East, right? It is still, you know, right at the heart of our interests, our allies, and right next to the liberal democratic world.
And before you two go, let me just add on to one thing. I mean, I'm very curious about this. Is there a non-military solution to the peril or to the challenge of ISIS? I mean, you would agree that there's a non-military solution to figuring out how to deal with the Muslim Brotherhood, but what about groups to the right of the Muslim Brotherhood? Is there a possibility, or is this just going to go back into a military confrontation?
I'm going to answer that in a second, but I actually want to broaden the conversation about extremist groups and how and when do they thrive. And I think that we can start there. So they thrive when states use excessive force. So Syria is an extreme example of that, but there are other examples in the region. So they thrive when political means fail. They thrive when they can make a credible argument for the fact that violence is the only solution, violence is the only way, and that the other side is using violence, and so it needs to be responded to with violence. If we want to disempower extremist groups and disempower violent approaches, we have to allow for space where political solutions work. My fear in Egypt, and I've seen this firsthand with young people actually expressing this view to me personally, is they are saying, we already tried ballots. We already tried to do this peacefully in Tahrir. Look at the response we're getting. Look at how many people were killed in Rabaa and in other places. What other choice do we have than to take up some form of a violent response to the government? And that's Egypt, let alone other parts of the Middle East, which are even more prone to this problem. So I don't think this issue of can we just sit back and watch the repression and the state violence and think that, you know, it's not our problem, these people have to figure it out. It will become our problem because it creates the ecosystem in which these groups thrive.
Can I add to that? I mean, what I'm really worried about now is that in the Middle East, the currency of politics, if you will, that works is force. And this has a lot of implications. And look, I don't want to kind of descend into cultural essentialism or anything like that. And you used to have people say, well, Arabs only understand force. Of course, that's nonsense. But the way the region is now, force has to be part of the calculation. So I worry sometimes that we as Americans understandably are very reticent about the use of force. And Obama has emphasized that in his recent speeches, West Point, UNGA before, that force is not just a last resort, it's like beyond a last resort. But if that's our approach, then we're going to a gunfight with a knife. And you know, we're not going to be able to compete with these guys. And I worry that Obama, as this kind of cerebral law professor, he has this deep belief that you can sit down with people and reason with them and have a dialogue and we can negotiate, we can find common ground. Sometimes you cannot do that.
But wait a second.
I'm also a cerebral law professor.
I mean, but he's a cerebral law professor who was also an assassin. I mean, he's got drones. Not a lot of law professors have drones. I mean, and he's shown himself, you know, and thank God, really, because that would be really
Harvard
horrifying.
Law School
Yeah, Harvard and Yale having a zero-sum drone fight would be kind of interesting, actually.
Yeah,
but I mean, let's not. I mean, you're giving a little bit of a character to the guy.
That's a different kind of use of force. I think it's a very problematic.
He's killing
use of
terrorists.
Force. I mean, you're just pushing a button and killing a lot of innocent civilians while you do it, and provoking Yemenis.
But that also goes against your theory that he's just a cerebral law professor who thinks he can reason with everybody. He obviously doesn't believe
but I think this is the worst kind of use of force. The only use of force that Obama is comfortable with is precisely the wrong kind.
All right. Back there, there's a question. Are you properly stimulated yet? I think it's very stimulating. Yeah, right there. Yeah. There's a lot of hands. I'm sorry if I don't get to everyone. We only have time for
obviously, there's a very brilliant panel, but Jeffrey, if I may have your permission to ask them, we all know the problems, we all know the horror, but it seems to me that Dalia made an important statement. There's not one Arab view. It's everybody. It's not uniform. So I'd like to ask this question. Instead of telling us how dangerous it is, I have now made you President of the United States. Anne-Marie, what specifically would you do? All I heard is bombing Syria. I haven't heard a specific statement by anybody. If you're the President of the United States, what would you do now? When you say intervene, what do you mean?
Okay. I appreciate the question, although I think I've been saying very clearly that what I would do, what I would do is to work with both the states in the region and all the states in the UN who would go with us to get broad multilateral agreement. I wouldn't do this just unilaterally, but we've got plenty of those states, much as we did in Kosovo. And I would then use force simultaneously against ISIS and against Assad. And I would use limited airstrikes, but they would be sufficient to make a real difference. You know, one of the things that happened again when we mobilized to use cruise missiles against, when we thought on the chemical weapons issue, when we did that against Syria, the ISIS folks headed for the hills. You remember that? There was a mass exodus because they're very afraid of our drones. So you can kill two birds with one stone, no pun intended. And what I would do is to do that, to make very clear to Assad the game is up. We are not going to let you continue massacring your people at the same time that we are addressing the terrorist threat. And then I would convene the folks that you can get from the moderate Syrian opposition, the other governments in the region. You're probably going to need some kind of stabilization force. It's probably not going to be U.S. troops, but it's going to be troops from multiple nations. And I would cobble together a political solution and try to see, how you then protect whatever zones, because I don't think you're going to put Syria back together. You're probably going to have various zones with different governments, and you stop the killing.
I'm gonna listen to everybody else on the panel. We're gonna end on that question. But Dalia, just to add on to that, let's assume this happens. You're an expert on Arab public opinion. Doesn't this look in some Arab eyes like the U.S. imposing its vision of the Middle East on the Middle East and killing Arabs? I mean, what is the take it wherever you want to go, but I would like you to answer that question.
I think it will look that way to some people, but I think, as a public opinion expert, I think we have to not always worry about public opinion and do what's right in this situation. And I do agree with Anne-Marie's vision for what is right. I think that ultimately we will win public opinion and just our own interests if we stop the killing.
If we stop the killing. Shadi, you want to end it there? Go ahead.
Okay, so and I think I agree largely with Anne-Marie, but I think there's a bigger theme here that we can't treat each theater as isolated. So it's not just Syria, and we focus on Syria. Then we have a different plan for Iraq, a different plan for Iran. And this is, I think, has been a big problem with this administration's approach. It's kind of treating these as discrete policy issues. So even on the Iranian nuclear negotiations, which is surprising that we haven't actually even mentioned that. That says something about...
That's in the second and third hour.
Yeah, the second and third hour, exactly. But what's been troubling to me, and actually that's one thing that I have supported the Obama administration on. I think that's much better than the alternative of military strikes. But why are we making it just about the nuclear program? Let's bring a discussion of Syria into that and a negotiated solution and try to push the Iranians to put real pressure on Assad. So, I mean, in the kind of Middle East that we live in today, it's interconnected. And that requires a broader vision, a broader approach. And I worry that we're always descending into this kind of ad hoc reactive policy that we wait for the fires to burn, then we start to put them out, but already it's burned down. So, I mean, that's where thank you.
Your golf cart is on that side, by the way, yeah.
So, I mean, ISIS was gaining ground for the past year, and then everyone acted surprised, and Obama administration officials were implying that this couldn't have been predicted. It could have been predicted. It was. I can name you 5 or 6 Syria experts, Anne Marie, who were actually saying this explicitly 2 years ago.
Could I just say one thing about Iran? Because that's very important. And I totally support what we're trying to do with Iran. There is one scenario in which you could do this without actually having to use force, but just the threat of it. If the Iranians believe we're serious about using force, the people we're negotiating with absolutely do not want us to do that, right? If we use force, it will support the hardliners in Iran, which will be bad for us and could torpedo the larger goal of getting an agreement. But if you threaten credibly that you're going to use force, that is a real reason for Iran then to push on Assad, because that's a better outcome for Iran as well.
Listen, I'm sorry this wasn't interesting or provocative, but I have to say thank you to our panel for a great discussion, and thank you for coming.